The moment I walked into the boardroom on the 4th floor and saw the old man from the cafeteria sitting at the head of the table, I genuinely thought I had opened the wrong door. I actually stepped back into the hallway to check the number on the wall, room 412. That was the room my supervisor had written on the sticky note she'd left on my locker that morning, the handwriting slightly hurried. The kind of note that doesn't tell you anything except that you're expected somewhere you weren't planning to be. I read it again. Report to 412 at 2 p.m. Don't be late. I'd spent the better part of my lunch break trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I hadn't come up with anything, which, in my experience, usually meant something was about to surprise me. And there he was, the same man, the same gray cardigan with the small pull near the left elbow, the same quiet eyes that didn't quite match the rest of his face, too still, too patient, like someone who had learned a long time ago that most things worth waiting for will eventually arrive if you just stop checking your watch. He was seated at the far end of the long table, and around him sat 6 or 7 people I didn't recognize, all in suits, all with the particular posture of people who are very used to being listened to. He looked at me when I came in. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his expression shifted, the way a door shifts when the latch releases. He remembered me. I was absolutely certain of that. My supervisor, Margaret, was standing near the window. She gestured for me to come in and close the door behind me, and I did, and I stood there in my scrubs with my ID badge still flipped backwards from when I'd been moving quickly through the East Corridor 20 minutes earlier, and I thought, 2 weeks ago I paid for this man's soup and sandwich, and now I am standing in a room I don't belong in, and I genuinely cannot tell if that is connected. It was connected. Of course it was connected, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I had been working at Ridgemont General for about 14 months when any of this happened. It's a mid-sized hospital about 40 minutes outside Ottawa, the kind of place that isn't large enough to have everything, but is close enough to the city that the staff tends to stay because the commute is reasonable and the community is real. I'd moved up from Halifax 2 years earlier for a relationship that didn't survive the first winter, and then I'd stayed because I'd found a job and a apartment and a small routine that I was beginning, cautiously, to love. I was a registered practical nurse on the internal medicine ward. It wasn't glamorous. There were long shifts and short staffing and a great deal of paperwork that nobody outside a hospital would believe exists, and the coffee in the break room was the kind of coffee that makes you genuinely question your choices. But I liked the patience. I liked the particular honesty that comes over people when they're unwell, the way small kindnesses become enormous, the way a warm blanket or an unhurried conversation can change the temperature of an entire room. I was good at it, not in a way I advertised, but in a way I knew privately, the way you know the things about yourself that are true without needing anyone else to confirm them. The ward had been under the direction of Dr. Harlan Price for 3 years by the time I arrived. I'd heard about him before I met him, the way you hear about weather before it arrives. He was a hospitalist, mid-50s, and he had the particular quality of a man who had been very competent at something for a very long time and had somewhere along the way confused competence with authority over everything. He wasn't cruel in an obvious way. It was more subtle than that. It was the way he spoke to the nursing staff in front of patients. The way he'd correct someone's pronunciation of a medication in a tone that carried just enough edge to land. It was the meetings where he made decisions that affected the ward without asking anyone on the ward, and then expressed surprise when those decisions caused problems. It was the small, consistent message that the people below him on the organizational chart were instruments rather than colleagues. Most of us had adapted. You learn the rhythms of a difficult person the way you learn the rhythms of a long winter, not with joy, but with a kind of practical fluency. You kept your head down. You did your work. You were careful about what you said and to whom, and you did not, under any circumstances, make yourself visible in a way that invited his attention. I had been careful. For 14 months, I had been careful. It was a Tuesday in early March when I first saw the old man. The cafeteria at Ridgemont General is on the main floor, near the east entrance, and it's the kind of space that tries harder than it needs to, with a mural on one wall that someone's cousin probably painted, and chairs that are almost comfortable. The food is genuinely decent, which is not something you can say about every hospital cafeteria. There's a woman named Diane who runs the soup station and has for about 20 years, and she knows everyone by name and remembers how they take their coffee, and she is, without question, one of the best parts of the building. I was on my lunch break, which I'd pushed to nearly 2:30, because the morning had been relentless, and I was carrying a tray with a bowl of split-pea soup and half a turkey sandwich and a bottle of water, and I was walking to the only empty table near the window when I noticed the line at the register had stopped moving. There was an elderly man at the front. He was slight, maybe 75, with white hair that had been combed but not recently, and he was wearing the gray cardigan and dark trousers, and he was looking down at the small debit machine on the counter with an expression I recognized. It's the expression of someone who already knows what's happened before the machine confirms it. Quiet, a little still, carefully not embarrassed. "It's saying declined," the young woman at the register said, not unkindly, but loudly enough that the 3 or 4 people behind him could hear. "I'm sorry," he said. He began reaching into the inside pocket of his cardigan, slowly, the kind of reaching that suggests the pocket doesn't have what he's hoping for. He had a bowl of beef, barley soup, and a coffee. The total on the register said $9.45. I set my tray down on the nearest table. I don't know that I made a decision exactly. It was more like my body acted before my thinking caught up. I walked to the counter and said, "I've got it," and I tapped my debit card before anyone could say anything. The young woman at the register looked at me. The man turned and looked at me. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "The soup's good today. Diane puts dill in it on Tuesdays." I picked up my tray and smiled at him and went to my table by the window, and I ate my lunch, and I didn't look over to see where he sat, because the whole point was that it wasn't a transaction. I thought about it for maybe 20 minutes after. Then the afternoon got busy, and I stopped thinking about it at all. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know for 2 weeks, was that the man's name was Robert Ashfield, that he had founded Ridgemont General's Primary Research Endowment in 2003, donating an amount that, adjusted for the 2 decades since, represented somewhere in the range of $40 million in research funding and capital improvements, that he sat on the hospital's board of governors, that he was, in fact, the chair of that board, a position he held with characteristic quietness, the kind of leadership that prefers to understand before it acts. That on the Tuesday I saw him, he had driven himself to the hospital because he'd been coming to Ridgemont for 40 years and didn't see a reason to change that. That his card had declined because he'd recently switched banks, and the new card hadn't fully activated yet, and he'd left his wallet in the car, and he'd been about to simply leave his soup and coffee and go without lunch. I didn't know any of this. I just knew the soup was good. The trouble with Dr. Price began the way most trouble does, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of smaller ones. In January, he had reassigned 2 of our best nurses to a pilot project on the 3rd floor, without consulting anyone on the ward, which left us understaffed for 6 weeks in the middle of flu season. When I mentioned this in a team meeting, carefully, framing it as a question about coverage rather than a criticism of the decision, he looked at me with the kind of patience that is not actually patience at all. "There are always going to be resource constraints," he said. "Managing within those constraints is part of professional practice." I said that I understood that, but that we were seeing patient wait times increase. He said that he appreciated my concern and that the situation was being monitored. It was not, as far as I could tell, being monitored. In February, there was an incident with a patient, an older woman named Mrs. Tremblay, who had been on our ward for 11 days with a respiratory infection that wasn't responding as quickly as expected. I had flagged in her chart that her anxiety was elevated and that she had responded well to a particular communication approach. Slower, more explanation, less clinical shorthand, and I had written this in the nursing notes because that's what nursing notes are for. Dr. Price had gone in for a consult, spoken to her in his usual efficient register for 4 minutes, and left. She was in tears when I came back to check on her. When I followed up with him, he told me that emotional distress was not uncommon in patients with extended hospital stays, and that as long as the clinical picture was stable, there wasn't a therapeutic intervention indicated. I stood in the corridor outside his office for a moment after that conversation, looking at the floor, doing the thing where you decide how much of your energy to spend and on what. I spent it on Mrs. Tremblay. I went back to her room and sat with her for 20 minutes, and by the end, she was smiling about a story involving her son and a very stubborn canoe, and that felt like the right use of my afternoon. But the friction had started, and we both knew it. In early March, the week before the cafeteria moment, Dr. Price called me into his office and told me that he had concerns about my documentation practices. He had a printed copy of 3 nursing notes from the previous month, and he went through them with a pen, indicating sentences he found unnecessarily detailed. He used the phrase scope creep twice. He told me that my role was to document clinical observations, not to make assessments about patient care approaches. I'm documenting what I'm observing and what's working, I said. You're editorializing, he said. I asked him if the notes had caused any clinical errors. He said that wasn't the point. I asked what the point was. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said that he hoped I understood the importance of working within established frameworks, and that he would be noting this conversation in my file. I thanked him for his time, which I knew was the wrong tone. But I was 28 years old and I had good instincts, and I had been sitting in that chair for 30 minutes being told that using them was a problem, and I had run out of accommodating responses. Margaret pulled me aside the next morning. She was my immediate supervisor, and she was kind and she was tired. The specific tired of someone who has been mediating between good people and a difficult system for longer than is sustainable. He's not wrong about documentation standards, she said, carefully. I know. But he's also... She stopped. Looked at her coffee cup. Just be careful, okay? He's flagged 2 other people in the last year. One of them transferred to Queensway. I said I understood. You're good at this job? She said. I mean that. Don't give him reasons. I thanked her and went to start my shift, and I thought about what she'd said all morning, and I thought, I am not going to stop writing good nursing notes because it makes someone uncomfortable. I am just going to be more careful about everything else. It wasn't enough. 2 days after I paid for the old man's soup, Dr. Price submitted a formal review request to hospital administration, citing concerns about my clinical judgment. I found out from Margaret, who was distressed in a way she was trying and mostly failing to conceal. The review wasn't a termination process, she explained. It was an evaluation, but it was the kind of evaluation that goes in your file and follows you. And in a mid-sized hospital where everyone knows everyone, it had a particular weight. I sat in my car in the parking lot after that conversation for about 10 minutes. The late winter sky was the particular white-gray of an Ontario March, and the snowbanks along the edge of the lot had turned the color of old dishwater, and I thought very carefully about whether I had done anything wrong. I had not done anything wrong. I was almost certain of that. I had done things that irritated a man with the power to make my working life difficult, which is not the same thing, even though it often gets treated as though it is. I drove home. I made tea. I called my older sister in Halifax, who has a very good instinct for when I need someone to be outraged on my behalf versus when I need someone to help me think, and she gave me about 15 minutes of the first, and then we moved to the second, and by the time I went to bed I had decided that I would respond to the review professionally, document everything carefully, and see what happened. What happened was the sticky note on my locker. I walked into room 412 at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon and found Margaret standing by the window and the old man from the cafeteria sitting at the head of a boardroom table surrounded by people I didn't know, and I stood there with my ID badge flipped backwards and tried very hard to look like I understood what was happening. Claire, Margaret said, thank you for coming on short notice. I nodded. I looked at the old man. He was watching me with those still, patient eyes. I believe you and Mr. Ashfield may have met, said a woman in a charcoal blazer seated to his right. Briefly, he said. His voice was measured and warm, the voice of a man who has stopped needing to prove things with volume. She paid for my lunch. There was a brief, particular silence. I said, the beef barley is worth it. Someone at the table made a sound that was almost a laugh. Mr. Ashfield's expression shifted again. That small movement near the eyes. The woman in the charcoal blazer introduced herself as Dr. Pauline Osei, the hospital's chief of staff. She said she was sorry for the unusual circumstances, and that she hoped I wasn't alarmed, and that they had asked me here because Mr. Ashfield had specifically requested to speak with me, and that she wanted me to understand that my employment was not in any question. I understood, then, that she knew about the review, that at least some of the people in this room knew about the review. Mr. Ashfield looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, I've been coming to this hospital for a long time. My wife was treated here. My daughter was born here. I've watched it become something I'm genuinely proud of. He paused. I also walk through it sometimes without announcing myself, because the way a place behaves when no one is watching tells you more than anything you'd see in a formal inspection. He looked at me directly. A few weeks ago, I was in a difficult situation and you helped me without making it difficult. That's a small thing. I'm not suggesting it should be rewarded. But it told me something about the culture of this ward. He opened a folder on the table in front of him. I couldn't see what was in it from where I was standing. I've been reviewing some information about your ward over the past 2 weeks, he said, including a review process that was recently initiated. Dr. Osei said, I want to be clear that the board's involvement in individual staff matters is not standard practice. However, given Mr. Ashfield's specific observations and the pattern of review requests originating from a single physician over the past 18 months, the board felt there was a governance concern worth examining. I said, I see. I didn't entirely see, but I was beginning to. What followed was not, in the end, dramatic. That surprised me a little, because I had been bracing for something with sharper edges. Dr. Price was not in the room. He wasn't going to be dressed down in front of me. That wasn't how any of this worked, and honestly, I was relieved by that. I had no interest in his humiliation. What I wanted was for the review to go away, and for the ward to be staffed properly, and for Mrs. Tremblay's nursing notes to be understood as exactly what they were. Dr. Osei explained that the board had initiated an independent review of the ward's operations, which would include staffing decisions, documentation standards, and the internal review processes that had been used over the past 18 months. She said this was not an accusation but an evaluation, and that its purpose was to ensure that clinical and administrative decisions aligned with the hospital's stated values. She said my file would be flagged as under independent review, which meant that Dr. Price's review request was effectively suspended pending the broader evaluation. She said the staffing levels on internal medicine would be reassessed immediately, and that 2 of the nurses reassigned in January would have the option to return to the ward within the next 2 weeks. She said, finally, that this was not something that needed to be discussed outside this room, and that she appreciated my discretion. I said I understood. Mr. Ashfield closed his folder. He looked at me again. I understand you've been on internal medicine for about 14 months, he said. Yes. Are you staying? I thought about that for a second. I thought about Mrs. Tremblay and the canoe story. I thought about Diane's Tuesday soup. I thought about my apartment and my routine and the particular morning light that came through the east corridor windows in the spring, which I had been looking forward to all winter. I am, I said. He nodded once, the nod of a man for whom one nod is sufficient. Margaret walked me out to the hallway. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, I didn't know he was going to be here. I want you to know that. I know, I said. Are you okay? I thought about it honestly. I think I will be, I said. Yeah. The independent review took about 6 weeks. I wasn't privy to most of it. I went to work. I wrote my nursing notes the way I'd always written them. The 2 nurses came back from the 3rd floor, and the ward found its footing again in the particular way that a short-staffed unit does when it finally has enough people, not all at once, but in the way that a room warms when you finally find the draft and close it. Dr. Price was still there. He was quieter. He did not pull me aside to discuss my documentation practices. I don't know what the review found or what was said to him. That was not my information to have. But there was a changed quality to the air on the ward, the way the air changes after a long pressure system finally moves on. I saw Mr. Ashfield once more, about a month later. I was coming out of the stairwell on the main floor, and he was walking through the lobby with the same unhurried pace, hands in his pockets. He didn't have a visitor badge, which told me he'd been there long enough that the front desk knew him by sight. He saw me and stopped. How's the soup? He asked. Diane added coriander, I said. I'm still adjusting. He smiled, an actual full smile this time, not just the thing near the eyes. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, I said. He walked on toward the east corridor, and I stood there for a second watching him go, this small, unhurried man in his gray cardigan, and I thought about all the ways a person can be present in a place without announcing themselves, all the ways that quiet attention to what's actually happening is its own kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. I've thought a lot, since then, about why any of it happened the way it did. I don't mean the boardroom meeting or the review, though I've thought about those too. I mean the moment at the register, the $9.45, the tap of a debit card before my thinking caught up. I wasn't kind to Robert Ashfield because I thought it would come back to me. I didn't know who he was. I genuinely did not think about him again for 2 weeks, not in any sustained way. If he had been exactly who he appeared to be, a retired man with a temporarily declined card and a bowl of beef barley soup, the story would have ended in the cafeteria, which is where stories like that usually end, in the small, private satisfaction of having done a thing that needed doing. I think about my grandmother sometimes, who lived outside Fredericton until she was 83, and who had a principle she applied so consistently and without comment that I didn't understand it was a principle until I was an adult. She helped people without calculating the return. Not out of naivety, she was one of the sharpest people I've ever known, but out of something that looked like faith. A belief that the world is roughly what we make of it when we act, and that acting well is its own return, regardless of what follows. She never said any of this explicitly. She just tapped her debit card, metaphorically speaking, and moved on. I think about the people who stayed quiet on the ward for longer than they should have. I think about the nurses who transferred, the ones whose names I didn't know well but whose absence I felt. I think about the fact that 14 months is not very long and that I almost didn't say anything either, almost let the documentation conversation go, almost absorb the pressure the way you absorb a long winter, just getting through it. What I keep coming back to is this. The moment I spoke up in that team meeting about staffing, I wasn't thinking about Mr. Ashfield. I wasn't thinking about reviews or boards or governance concerns. I was thinking about the patients on our ward, and the nurses stretched thin across too many beds, and the particular exhaustion of trying to do good work in a system that is quietly making it harder. I said something because it needed to be said. That's the whole of it, really. The rest is logistics. There's a diner about 10 minutes from the hospital. It's been there since the 80s. The kind of place with booths and laminated menus and a pie display that rotates by season. I started going on Sunday mornings after I moved up from Halifax, mostly because I didn't know anyone in the area yet, and it was a way to be somewhere without being alone in my apartment. I still go, usually around 9, when it's starting to fill up, but the booths by the window are still available. The person who works Sunday mornings knows my order now, a flat white and the French toast, and she brings the coffee over without being asked. I think about something the person who makes the soup at the hospital cafeteria once said to me when I asked how she remembered everyone's orders. She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "I just pay attention," she said. "That's all it is." I've been thinking about that lately. About how much of what we call generosity is really just attention, noticing that someone's card has been declined and they're standing very still, carefully not embarrassed. Noticing that a patient's anxiety is elevated and writing it down in plain language so the next person who comes in knows to slow down. Noticing that the ward has too few people and saying so in a meeting even when the temperature in the room is telling you to stay quiet. Paying attention, saying something, sometimes paying $9.45 for a bowl of soup. The Marine Corps teaches you a lot of things, the story I heard once said. I'm not in any corps. I'm a practical nurse from Halifax, living in a mid-sized Ontario city, and what this job has taught me, slowly and without ceremony, is something simpler than that. It has taught me that the quality of a place is carried by the people in it, in the smallest interactions, in the notes we write and the choices we make when no one we're trying to impress is watching. It has taught me that those interactions accumulate, and that what they add up to is either a place where people are cared for, or a place where they are managed, and that the difference between those two things is not a policy or a review process but 1,000 small moments of attention every single day. I was a small part of something that shifted at Ridgemont General that spring. I know that, and I'm glad of it. But the part I hold on to, the part that feels most true, is this. On a Tuesday in early March, I walked past a man with a declined card and I stopped. I paid $9.45 for a stranger's lunch. I said the soup was good and I went to sit by the window. That was the moment. The rest was just what happened after.